2 days ago came the entry of Israeli troops into Egypt.
The Suez Crisis burst dramatically into the news again, for Israel has invaded Egypt.
Was that a dangerous situation? Was it likely to lead to a widespread flare-up in the Middle East? In the judgment of the government, it was.
Within hours, the leading Israeli columns are driving towards the canal. Britain and France react at once with an ultimatum. Stop the fighting or we march in.
Was it likely to endanger widespread British and international interests? It was.
Without warning, Israel strikes. General Prottayon, one-eyed commander-in-chief, orders the tanks into act. Israeli patrols carry out a house-to-house search, checking identities to guard against hostile infiltration.
It seems that Israel has succeeded in destroying the bases in Sinai and Gaza.
The Middle East. Extensive damage with shattered homes on the Gaza Strip. Mark recent clashes between Egyptian and Israeli forces. Skirmishes described as border incidents.
Grim, hard fact. The reality, which no words could alter.
There were demonstrations by Palestinian Arabs calling for the return of Egyptian control.
These actions mean not only to end the fighting now, but also to bring a lasting peace to an area which for 10 years has lived or tried to live under the constant threat of war.
Egypt, ready to place the Gaza Strip under international control, the United Nations emergency force was poised on the border.
The first question isn't how it started, but how to put it out.
The United Nations force moves in at night while a curfew was in force.
There are times for courage, times for action. And this is what, in the interests of peace, I do hope we've learned our lesson.
Meanwhile, the United Nations troops have taken over military control in Gaza, and the Middle East trouble spot becomes a problem of the World Parliament of Nations.
Before numbers and blame, a frame. Gaza, in early November 1956, was an administered place. Refugee camps run on ration cards and school rolls, United Nations clinics logging treatments, municipal offices issuing permits and burial notices, parish books recording deaths, Bedouin families moving along routes older than the border. When the army arrived, most civilians didn't meet a battle, they met orders. Curfew proclamations went up on walls and out over radio. Whole districts were marked closed areas. Movement after set hours required a stamped permit. The language sounded bureaucratic. The consequence was blunt. Be visible, be controllable. Step outside the rule and risk being shot. From curfew flowed screening. On paper it meant identification and questioning. In practice, it meant summons into the open. People were told to leave their homes and gather in courtyards, schoolyards, junctions, open fields. Lines formed, not once, but repeatedly across the month. Men separated from boys and elders, women and children stood aside or were brought later. Documents were checked, names were read, a missing permit, a mismatched address, a rumour whispered 2 streets away. Any of these could be enough. Those pointed out were walked to holding points, classrooms, yards, improvised pens. Some returned after hours, some after days, some did not return. Survivors later described the waits, standing under sun or cold from morning until night, listening for names that meant release or disappearance. This method landed on a system already under strain. Hospital capacity had collapsed during the occupation, wounded lay on floors. Morgues filled faster than they could be cleared, mosque committees hauled ice to slow decomposition. Families dug hurried graves. Even UNRWA would later admit its lists of the dead could never be complete, because many were buried before they could be identified. United Nations field reports from the same month noted the same gap. Burials carried out before names could be entered in the record. Gaza's density multiplied the harm, in a territory already packed with refugees. A curfew didn't just quiet a town, it emptied entire camps. A screening meant to isolate a few suspects, swept entire neighborhoods. Families waited days with no word. Think about that for a moment. Whole camps pulled into lines, entire communities reduced to silence for a single permit check. And it wasn't only townspeople. South of Rafah, Bedouin families were driven from a coastal strip in the name of border security, losing grazing land and the mobility that kept them alive. Parish clerks in Gaza recorded sudden clusters of burials. Teachers marked empty desks. Women carried household papers, tended the injured, and filed petitions for husbands and sons who never came home. The language of the moment did its own work. Official phrasing compressed what happened into neutral words: incidents, disturbances, screening operations. In Arabic newspapers that same week, the words were blunter: killings, mass shootings. Both sets still sit in the archives. The contradiction was present from the start. One more piece of context mattered. Inside Israel, that same week, the Kafr Qasim curfew killings showed how lethal after-hours enforcement could be. Courts there would later call such orders blatantly illegal. In Gaza, no such accountability followed. The point isn't to equate cases, it's to show continuity of doctrine. Curfew as control, and the risk that control turns deadly. The sequence matters. Curfew to empty streets, screening to control bodies and names, detention and transfer, to remove those marked doubtful. This was not the first time Palestinians were ordered from their homes, nor the last. Occupation does not erase civilian protections. Civilians are to be safeguarded from violence and intimidation, and collective punishment is forbidden. We'll test those rules against what happened next. First at Khan Younis, then days later, Rafah. That is the order civilians met it. Khan Younis met the sequence first. In the first days of November, soldiers pushed into the town and the camps around it. Road junctions were sealed, a curfew declared, loudspeakers and patrols told people to stay indoors until called. Then the summons began. Residents described being ordered into the open, courtyards, schoolyards, patches of hard ground near the market. Lines formed again and again across those days. Men separated from boys and elders, women and children told to stand back, or wait at home until names were called. Documents checked, lists read, anyone whose papers didn't match an address, anyone named by rumour, anyone whose name appeared on a list, pulled from the line and marched to holding points, classrooms, municipal yards, fenced corners. Some of the first shootings in Khan Younis came during this process. Accounts describe bursts of gunfire when people moved too slowly under orders, or volleys fired directly into the assembled lines. Clinics recorded a sudden intake of gunshot wounds. Bodies reached the morgue faster than they could be processed. Parish and municipal registers show clusters of burials in those same days, some with names, many without. United Nations field workers in Gaza noted the same gap. Burials carried out before names could be entered in the record. Numbers remain contested. Lists kept by UNRWA, hospitals, and camp committees counted the dead in large figures by the month's end. But each list saw only part of the picture, bodies brought to a clinic, names a clerk recognised, reports a committee could gather before the next curfew. Some survivors insist the toll was higher. Official accounts from the time offered low accounts, and called the deaths a side effect of disturbances or rioting. When I compared the lists, I saw the overlap, names repeated on one register, missing from another. Some deaths weren't recorded until days later, when the wounded died in hospital. That chaos wasn't random. It was structural. For now, the shape of the event matters. People gathered under orders, screenings carried out under rifles, and live fire used among civilians. Think about that. Summoned by the same authority that then opened fire into the lines it created. Detentions moved alongside the shootings. Men were marched from Khan Younis to temporary compounds, some questioned and released within hours, others after days. A portion transferred out of the district. Families filed petitions with UNRWA and local offices. Many never received confirmation of where a relative had been taken. Teachers crossed out names in attendance books. Mothers waited outside checkpoints, clutching documents that no longer opened doors. Women's labour anchored the hours between orders. They carried papers for households, negotiated with patrols, ferried water before curfew, and tended the injured in overcrowded rooms. Bedouin families on the edges of Khan Younis tightened their circles, but curfew and checkpoints turned movement itself into a risk. Who held effective control those days? Orders ran down an established chain. Local commanders decided how screenings were conducted. Patrols had enforced the curfew that made the lines possible. Some parts of that chain are clear in the record, others remain shadowed by missing minutes and understated memoranda. What's clear is this: the live fire and detentions didn't come from panic in a crowd. They came from orders executed through a chain of command. By the time the army shifted focus south, the pattern in Khan Younis was set. Curfew to clear streets, screening to control bodies and names, detention and transfer to remove those marked doubtful, live fire used among civilians gathered under orders, hospitals and morgues overrun, burials hurried, lists incomplete. Days later, Rafah would see the same method, scaled and systematized. That is where we go next. Days after Khan Younis, the same sequence unfolded in Rafah, but here it was larger, more deliberate, and more bureaucratic. Rafah sat at the southern edge of the strip, a town ringed by refugee camps and Bedouin encampments. It was also the point nearest the Sinai border, and by November 1956, Israeli forces saw it as a place to secure through sheer control. The orders went out, curfew imposed, areas sealed, and the population summoned into the open. This time the screenings weren't scattered through streets. Entire neighborhoods were emptied at once. Witnesses recall thousands herded into open fields. Schoolyards and compounds rows stretched for hours in the sun. Men were pulled into lines of their own. Women and children waited at the edges with documents and food. Children clung to mothers as names were read. Soldiers checked papers against lists. Clerks took notes. People were marked for questioning or marched away. The detentions in Rafah were not just temporary. Hundreds were transferred out of the district, some to holding camps deeper inside Gaza, some across into Sinai, others disappeared entirely from the record. Families filed petitions. Some detainees returned days later, others never came back. Casualties mounted here too. Reports from clinics and committees speak of gunfire into crowds, of people collapsing in the lines, of bodies carried away before they could be identified. Hospitals in Rafah and Gaza City overflowed. United Nations workers on the ground noted the same pattern they had seen in Khan Younis. Burials carried out before names could be entered in the record. Numbers are again disputed. Camp committees and UNRWA offices counted large totals by the end of the month. Israeli accounts spoke of far fewer deaths, and framed the operation as a necessary security measure. What stands out in Rafah is the scale. Where Khan Younis was sudden and violent, Rafah shows the method applied like a template, curfew declared, entire populations summoned, mass lines screened, detainees processed, records logged, all under the shadow of force. I kept coming back to the paperwork here, clipboards, registers, lists. On their own they look like administration. In Rafah, they became part of the machinery of violence. And that violence was not incidental. Quiet planning, resources, and approval. International law forbids the transfer of civilians outside occupied territory. Yet Rafah saw hundreds marched across the border. Women bore much of the unseen weight. They queued with household documents, searched hospitals for the wounded, and prepared food and water for relatives held in fields. Teachers found their schools half empty. Bedouin families caught in the sweeps saw their mobility, the one protection they had, turned into liability at checkpoints. Parish clerks in Gaza recorded another surge of burials in November, matching the reports of the camps. By the time the sweeps ended, the method was unmistakable: curfew, screening, detention, transfer, gunfire in the lines. Hospitals and morgues overwhelmed, burials hurried and unrecorded, families left without answers. Khan Younis had been the first shot. Rafah was the proof it was not an accident, but a system. It was also where the screenings became a machine for disappearances. When entire neighborhoods were called into the fields, the lines didn't end when the crowds went home. Hundreds of men were separated and marched to holding sites. Some questioned and released the same day. Others kept under guard for days. A portion taken out of Rafah altogether. Transfers split families without notice. Detainees were sent to compounds deeper inside Gaza, to camps in Sinai, or into facilities beyond the Strip. Some reappeared weeks later. Many did not. Families filed petitions with UNRWA and the Red Cross. The replies when they came were often formulaic. Not on list. No information available. International Committee of the Red Cross field files from that month recorded the same pattern. Petitions logged, searches initiated, answers inconclusive. It wasn't just silence. It was bureaucratic silence, crafted at desks of authority. Teachers marked names absent, then drew lines through them when days turned into weeks. For Bedouin families, the sweeps meant more than lost men. The expulsion from grazing land at Rafah's edge severed routes that defined survival. Their mobility was turned into liability. Their petitions often never reached the desks where decisions were made. The numbers remain blurred. UNRWA and camp committees recorded hundreds detained. By month's end, many were still unaccounted for. Israeli reports spoke of brief questioning and rapid releases, with only a small number transferred. Press dispatches told of mass arrests and collective punishment. Later, United Nations debates cited these detentions explicitly, even as the figures remained contested. Each version reflected the position of its author. None cancelled the others. The absence itself became the fact civilians lived with: empty beds, empty desks, meals uneaten, papers filed and unanswered, children waiting at doorways for fathers who did not return. Think about that. Absence so common it became routine. Yet every absence was a person. The law is not silent here. Detention under occupation must follow clear rules. The reason given, the person named, the family informed. Transfers outside the occupied territory are explicitly forbidden. Collective punishment is prohibited. Rafah's petitions and ledgers, and the silences within them, show how those rules were broken.
Nearly 10 years of experience have taught the lesson that decisions of this Council, weighty as they are, decisions of this Council in regard to Israel and our Arab neighbours are slow to take effect. But the situation facing us all is one of the most immediate urgency. Unless action is taken at once, and by once I mean in a very few hours, we believe that the canal may be put out of operation, and that the fighting may spread outside the Sinai Peninsula.
When the sweeps ended, Rafah was left not just with burials and injuries, but with names missing from every kind of list. The lists that were kept, the lists that were promised, and the lists that were never written. What happened in Khan Younis and Rafah was not only fought on the ground, it was also fought in words. In Arabic newspapers that November, the language was stark. Headlines spoke of mass shootings, reprisals, and killings of civilians. In the Hebrew press, the phrasing softened. Dava described disturbances in Gaza. Other reports spoke of incidents and security operations. International wire services carried both versions, Reuters and AFP dispatches citing hundreds of dead. Israeli briefings insisting the deaths came in clashes with rioters. BBC monitoring caught the contradiction in real time. Radio Cairo broadcasted of massacres in refugee camps. Kol Israel described necessary measures to restore order. What struck me, reading those side by side, was how two radios could tell the world opposite stories about the same streets on the same day. The United Nations added another layer of language. UN field staff used the phrase incidents in Gaza in their reports. By the time the debate reached the General Assembly, the phrasing was more deliberate still. Regrettable events, civilian casualties resulting from security measures. At the very same time, UNRWA staff in the camps were keeping death lists and quietly writing that their records would never be complete. Silence wasn't only about words, it was also about omission. Israeli censorship restricted coverage inside Gaza. Foreign correspondents were confined to brief communiques. Cabinet talking points warned against acknowledging high civilian casualties, framing the actions instead as screenings for infiltrators. That silence was structured, designed to protect policy rather than civilians. There were dissenting voices too. A handful of Israeli journalists and politicians argued that firing into crowds of civilians could not be excused as security screening. Their warnings didn't change policy, but they remain in the record, proof that even at the time, the line between security and atrocity was visible. For civilians in Gaza, language was not abstract. To bury neighbours without names, and then read about disturbances, was another wound. Loss was lived in homes and schools, in the press. It was reframed, softened, or denied. Think about that for a second. Mourning a brother or child and then hearing them spoken of as if they were a rioter, and the law does not allow euphemism to erase responsibility. International protections for civilians apply whether a report calls them rioters or refugees. The duty to safeguard remains the same. When we set these words and silences beside the field accounts, the pattern is plain. Violence was committed in the open, but was also shaped, minimized, and contested in language. After the shootings, after the transfers, daily life didn't return to normal. It shifted into survival. Curfews left streets empty for days at a time. Families rationed food carefully, not knowing when shops would open again. UNRWA convoys, noted in November reports, were slowed or blocked at checkpoints. That wasn't logistical confusion, it was deliberate control, turning food into a bargaining chip. Women carried permits through patrols to fetch flour or water. Some were turned back, some were let through. Each journey was a risk. Children waited beside their mothers at gates, clutching empty tins. In the camps, classrooms fell silent. Teachers marked rows of empty desks, some temporary, some permanent. Lessons stopped not only because of missing children, but because curfews closed schools entirely. Parish clerks wrote of suspended services. Refugees who had already lived years in tents or crowded shelters found themselves confined still tighter. Hospitals worked with fewer staff. Reports noted doctors unable to reach patients, and patients unable to reach doctors. Wounded treated at home with whatever supplies families could find. Mosque committees organised to move ice, water and bread. In some camps, women formed small networks, taking turns to carry food to households under the harshest curfews. What struck me most was how often those records mentioned women, carrying, organising, keeping households alive while the formal system faltered. Bedouin families displaced from Rafah's edge survived by pulling deeper into the strip. They lost access to grazing routes and relied instead on neighbours' rations. For a community defined by movement, immobility became a wound of its own. Even radio spoke in contradiction. Cairo announced massacres. Kol Israel reported restored order. UN summaries called them incidents. Refugee committees wrote of hunger and empty shelves. For civilians listening, the truth wasn't measured in broadcasts. It was measured in the knock on the door, or the absence at the table. Think about that for a moment, listening to a radio that says order has been restored while staring at an empty shelf. This is not to paint Gaza only in terms of suffering. Survival itself was a form of resistance. Families kept registers of the dead when official lists failed. Teachers kept rolls even in empty classrooms. Parish clerks and mosque committees buried the unclaimed with dignity. And the law is clear. International protections guarantee access to food, water, and medical care under occupation. To obstruct these is not a bureaucratic inconvenience, it is a breach of obligation. Occupation reshaped daily life into scarcity and fear, but it did not erase community. That thread of persistence is visible in the records, in the testimonies, and in the survival of those who carried on under curfew. Every curfew, every screening, like every disappearance, rested on a chain of orders. To understand Khan Younis and Rafah, we have to follow that chain, not only down to the fields, but up into cabinets, ministries, and international halls. At the base were patrols and junior officers. They enforced curfew hours, drove families into lines, decided who moved too slowly, who was pulled aside, and who was marched away. Above them sat company and battalion commanders. Field records and survivor accounts show they chose how screenings unfolded, whether to summon entire neighborhoods at once, whether live fire was used as warning, how detainees were processed or transferred. But the shootings and detentions of November 1956 did not emerge from field improvisation alone. They followed a policy climate set at the top. Cabinet minutes from Israel's leadership show debates on how to frame Gaza abroad, not on how to protect civilians. Talking points circulated to diplomats instructed them to speak of screening infiltrators and incidents. Civilian casualties were acknowledged in private, but minimized or denied in public. And this was not only an Israeli story. Gaza in November 1956 sat inside the Suez Crisis. Britain sought to hold the canal. France wanted to punish Nasser for backing Algerian independence. Israel saw its chance to tighten its grip on Gaza and strike deep into Sinai. Three powers aligned, each pursuing their own gain, while Palestinians bore the cost. The United Nations revealed the same split between principle and practice. UN field staff reported bluntly on burials and missing names. Yet in New York, those lines were softened into regrettable events and security measures. What struck me, reading those debates, was how much truth was lost in translation, not lost by accident, but softened deliberately. The International Committee of the Red Cross logged petitions and searches, but could not compel answers. UNRWA listed the dead and wounded, but had no power to protect the living. Institutions noted the suffering, but the structures above them chose caution over confrontation. Inside Israel, dissenting voices existed: journalists, politicians, and Jewish citizens who opposed Zionist militarism and warned of atrocity. Their words remain in the record, proof that the violence was not invisible, but that they were marginalized. Zionist elites carried on, and wider society, through silence, belief, or fear, allowed the system to run. Accountability therefore runs in layers. It lies with the patrol who pulled a trigger. It lies with the commander who approved live fire. It lies with the cabinet that ordered the occupation and denied its cost. It lies with the colonial powers that enabled it, and the global institutions that softened it. And it lies with the ideology of Zionism itself, an ideology that promised security through dispossession, and drew legitimacy not only from generals, but from civilians willing to accept or promote violence against their neighbours. For Palestinians in Gaza, accountability was not abstract. It was lived in missing names, silent registers, unanswered petitions, and silences in international halls, and November 1956 did not stand alone. It sat within a longer pattern of Zionist policy, removing Palestinians from their homes, controlling their movement, denying their losses, and recasting their reality as incidents. Think about that for a moment. A massacre reframed as an incident, a disappearance written off as not on list. Those words were part of the violence too. The record of Khan Younis and Rafah shows it clearly. What happened was not accidental, it was policy, it was partnership, it was permitted. Gaza, November 1956. Curfew, screening, detention, transfer. Names on lists became lives in limbo. I worked from records, testimonies, and official documents, triangulated across independent sources. Then we turned to 1967. 6 days redraw the map. Controls deepen, checkpoints harden, permits multiply, policing the movement of people already forced from their homes. You'll find sources in the description and the full Palestine deep dive playlist for the story so far. Read widely, compare. Build your own view, human first, affiliation second. If this helped, subscribe and share it with one person who values evidence and empathy. Thanks for watching Prottayon. Keep questioning, stay curious, and most of all, take care.